About a month ago, I was working in a forest with a crew cutting down trees for a new housing project. I wasn't thrilled about it, but it paid the bills. These days, I'm working with someone local, but that's unrelated to the story. Logging is tough work, and spending so much time in the woods means you sometimes stumble on odd things, like abandoned tents, piles of trash, clothes, and even the occasional shoe. A few years back, someone found human remains out there. They still haven't been identified, which is unsettling. I've been in this line of work for a few years but hadn't come across anything noteworthy. Just the typical discarded stuff. That changed one evening. It was around 6 p.m. and we were wrapping up for the day. It's dangerous to work in the dark, so we usually knock off early in winter. There were only 2 other guys with me, and while they stayed by the truck, I wandered into the woods to relieve myself. Nature calls, and out there, the forest is often the only option. Sure, we had a portable toilet, but no one really wants to use those unless necessary. While I was trying to get things moving, let's just say I'd been having some issues lately, I heard a branch snap behind me. It was getting darker, and I'd wandered further from the truck than I should have, so I started feeling uneasy. I tried to glance back without losing focus on what I was doing when I heard another snap, followed by laughter. That's when I figured it was my coworkers messing with me. "If you wanted to embarrass me, just say so," I shouted, half turning. One of them called back, "Hurry up, it's freezing." I heard them walk away toward the truck, and eventually, their voices faded. I finished up, zipped up, and started heading back when I heard another snap, this time farther away. I paused. It sounded like it came from where I had been facing. "Real funny, guys," I called, expecting them to jump out and scare me, but there was no response, no laughter. The forest was quiet. "Come on, let's go." I tried again, but nothing. Frustrated, I muttered something about leaving them behind if they didn't knock it off. Then, just as I turned around to leave, I heard it again. Snap. This time it came from right behind me. I turned and started to say something, but the words froze in my throat. Standing far off in the untouched woods was something. It was about my height, maybe 6 feet, but its head was oddly shaped, almost too big for its body. Steam rose off it, though the air was icy, around 20 degrees. It had no fur, no hair, just bare skin, which made the steam all the more alarming. But what stopped me cold were its eyes. They glowed red, almost like how an animal's eyes reflect light. But these were different, more intense. I could hear its breathing, heavy and raspy, almost like a growl. It was far enough away, maybe 50 yards, but the sound carried. My instincts kicked in, and I started backing away toward the truck, heart racing. I wasn't sure how far I had wandered, but I hoped I wasn't too far. Soon I was running. That's when I heard it. The pounding of something massive crashing through the forest behind me. Whatever it was fast. I glanced back and saw it moving on all fours, even though it had looked like it walked upright before. I shouted toward my coworkers, "Start the truck. There's something out here." They either didn't hear me or thought I was joking. I ran harder until I could see them. They were casually hanging by the truck, laughing until they saw my face. That's when they realized I wasn't kidding. I jumped in, yelling for them to get moving. They hesitated until the thing chasing me crested a hill. Its wheezing growl filled the air, and they scrambled into the truck just as it slammed into the side, denting the door. We sped off, the creature screaming behind us before disappearing into the woods. Back on the road, we were all shaken. My friends apologized for not believing me, but I wasn't focused on that. I was terrified about going back. The next day, we told our boss. He didn't believe us at first, but the dent in the truck was hard to ignore. Regardless, we had to go back. No work meant no pay, and we couldn't afford to skip. That day was quiet. Everyone stuck to themselves, uneasy. Only a few of us were there, tasked with cleaning up the site. By the afternoon, as we were loading equipment, the growling returned from the south. We froze, scanning the woods. At first, we couldn't see anything, which was even scarier. Then one of my coworkers pointed it out. The creature was back, closer this time. We bolted for the truck. One of the guys grabbed a pistol from the glove box and fired off a few shots. 2 seemed to hit, 1 in the leg, 1 in the chest. Staggered but didn't fall. We didn't wait to see what happened next. We sped off again. The following morning, I called a local wildlife organization to report what we saw. I don't know if they took me seriously, even when I mentioned the gunshots. I just hoped they didn't go looking for it. The weeks that followed were quiet. We never saw the creature again. Maybe it left the area, or maybe those shots were enough to kill it. Whatever it was, I'm just glad I haven't had to face it again. I still don't know what it was. So, I'm sure most people have heard about those mysterious staircases in forests, right? If not, you should check out that story by the park ranger. It's pretty detailed. Personally, I always thought the whole thing was nonsense. If I recall, we never got a clear answer about why climbing them is supposed to be a bad idea. I don't know if that story was partly true or entirely made up, but I can guarantee this one is real. This happened nearly 6 years ago, and the memory still feels vivid because of how bizarre it was. There's a thick forest behind my property. I'd wandered back there a few times out of curiosity, but I never went far enough to stumble across anything interesting like streams or hidden meadows. One day, early in spring, I decided to explore more thoroughly since the land technically belonged to me when I bought the house. I'd walked about a mile in when I stumbled across something that made me stop in my tracks. It was a stone staircase standing in the middle of a crumbling brick foundation, maybe 30 feet long by 15 feet wide. The base was barely a foot high, but the stairs themselves rose around 6 feet. It was odd how they stood there without any visible support. I thought it would be cool to climb to the top and get a better view of the surrounding woods. I moved cautiously since the stairs didn't look very sturdy. To my surprise, I made it to the top without any trouble. But the moment I turned around, hoping to catch a glimpse of my house in the distance, things went wrong. My foot dislodged a loose stone and I slipped. As I fell, I braced myself for the harsh impact of the ground below. But instead of hitting dirt, my hands sank into icy, powdery snow. Remember, this was early spring. There shouldn't have been any snow. And it wasn't snowing when I climbed up either. Shocked, I scrambled to my feet, freezing in my sneakers, cargo pants, and light jacket. Looking around, I saw the entire forest blanketed in thick snow, at least a foot deep. More snowflakes were falling steadily from the sky. The staircase was still standing, just as before, but now surrounded by this winter landscape. My mind was spinning. Was I dreaming? Had I hit my head and blacked out? The snow felt real, too real. My fingers were numb after just a few moments of digging through the snow to look for my phone, which was nowhere to be found. I decided to head back toward my house, hoping the walk would somehow snap me out of whatever this was. The cold bit into my toes as I trudged through the snow. After what felt like an eternity, I finally reached my yard, but something was off. My car wasn't there. Instead, 2 unfamiliar vehicles and a small purple bicycle were parked in the driveway. Still convinced I was dreaming, I went inside. A holiday wreath fell off the door as I entered. The inside was decorated for Christmas. My house, but not my house. From another room, I heard a television and a man's voice calling out, "Who's there?" Moments later, a tall man appeared, holding a baseball bat and looking ready to swing. I froze and tried to explain that I didn't know what was happening, but he shouted that I was crazy and threatened to call the police. When he swung the bat at me and hit the wall, sending drywall crumbling to the floor, I bolted out of there. Panicked, I ran back into the woods and retraced my steps to the staircase. Gasping for breath, I stared at it, thinking through everything that had happened. That's when a wild idea struck me. What if climbing and falling from the stairs had somehow caused all this? Maybe doing it again would reverse it. With no better plan, I climbed back up, turned toward where my house should be, and let myself fall. This time, I hit the hard, unforgiving ground. But when I looked around, the snow was gone, and the warm spring sun was shining again. I made my way back to the house, where my car was parked, and everything seemed normal. No man with a bat, no strange cars. Took me a long time to process what had happened. After thinking it over, I've come to a conclusion that sounds unbelievable. When I fell the first time, I think I landed in the past. The man I ran into was the previous owner of the house. I remembered him because he told me he sold the place after his daughter left for college, wanting to downsize. He'd also mentioned a disturbing event that happened years ago but wouldn't share details. Looking back, I can't help but wonder if I was the disturbing event he was talking about. He said I looked familiar, and we agreed I resembled my dad, whom he once went to school with. I know how crazy this sounds, but it's the only explanation that fits. If anyone has a better theory, I'd love to hear it. In the meantime, here's a word of advice. If you ever find a staircase in the woods, don't climb it. I own a small patch of land in the forest. I head out there every so often to escape life's usual noise. While I bring my phone and laptop with me, they're mainly for browsing the internet. It's more about disconnecting from the hustle of daily life than avoiding technology altogether. I'm glad I have them now, as I can share this story where others might read it. Over the past few days, I've been hearing strange noises under my cabin. Something crawling around down there. I'm not sure what animals live in these woods, but this thing moves quickly. Sometimes I hear scratching or even low growls. It's been keeping me awake at night, so I decided to call someone to investigate. I'd found the area where it seemed to be entering, but I didn't have the skills to deal with this sort of thing myself. The person I called came out earlier today, and now I feel like I have even more questions. The hole leading under the cabin wasn't much more than a foot wide, so he had to crawl through it. He snapped some pictures of the area while he was under there and thought he might have seen something briefly, but then dismissed it as his imagination. When he came out, we reviewed the photos together, and I didn't know how to react. Deep claw marks were everywhere, etched into the ground, the wooden beams, and even the concrete pillars holding up the cabin. I pressed him about what could have done this, but he kept insisting it was a bear. I've seen bears before, and there's no way one could have fit under there. This guy barely fit himself, and he wasn't much over 120 pounds. The last photo he showed me was of a small depression in the dirt, maybe 6 inches deep and a foot across. I tried to get more answers, but he reassured me it wasn't anything serious and promised to return the next day to take care of it. I wanted to believe him, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. That night, I decided to call the local wildlife office instead. It was late, so I left a message explaining what had been happening and hoped they'd get back to me soon. The next 2 days were rough, no return call and barely any sleep. Whatever was under the cabin seemed angrier after the inspection. The growling and scratching got worse, lasting hours before it finally stopped. I managed to doze off around 2 a.m. By the time I woke up later that morning, I still hadn't heard back from the wildlife office. I tried calling them again, but spent nearly an hour on hold before giving up. I stayed indoors all day, too nervous to venture out with that thing still lurking. After all, if it could scratch through concrete, I didn't want to imagine what it might do to me. The pest control guy never returned, nor did he answer my calls. That night, I was on my own. I didn't even bother trying to sleep at first. Instead, I scrolled through online forums to distract myself. Sure enough, the noises started again. This time, though, they seemed calmer, less frantic. It felt like the creature was settling back in after the disturbance. I'd hear it shuffle around for a while, leave, and then come back. The fourth time it returned, I heard a loud thud, which caught my attention. After that, there was silence, no more scratching, growling, or movement. I thought it might have finally gone to sleep, so I let myself drift off too. The next morning, I was jolted awake by an overwhelming stench. It was so bad that stepping outside made it even worse. I nearly vomited right there on the porch. That's when the wildlife office finally called back, saying they were on their way. I told them about the smell, and they assured me they'd bring the necessary equipment. When they arrived, they donned protective gear, coveralls, gloves, and gas masks. One worker crawled under the cabin while the other stayed outside to assist. After about 20 minutes, they managed to drag out what was causing the smell. I couldn't identify the creature. It looked like a large dog, but most of its fur was gone. If it was a dog, it was severely diseased. They explained that it must have hit its head on a beam while running around, breaking its neck. The body had turned a bluish-gray overnight, and the stench was so unbearable that even the workers gagged through their masks. As they continued clearing the area, they found 6 small, let's call them pups, in a hollowed-out section of dirt. Sadly, all of them were dead, likely stillborn. The workers said they'd arrange for a cleanup crew and advised me to leave for a while. I didn't argue. I packed up and left. It's been a few days, and I haven't heard any updates. Part of me wonders if I stumbled upon something I wasn't supposed to. I'm too scared to go back and find out. About a week ago, I found myself completely alone, and this happened in Georgia. A friend of mine mentioned a fishing spot he'd stumbled upon a few days earlier, and I decided to check it out. He had caught a decent amount there, so I figured I'd give it a shot. I asked him to tag along, but his son wasn't feeling well, so he stayed home to care for him. I told him no problem and headed out on my own, relying on the directions he had described to me. After a bit of navigating, I reached the place. It was tucked away pretty deep in the forest, but I've always had a decent sense of direction, so I wasn't worried about getting turned around. When I got there, I realized this wasn't just a regular fishing spot. It was the size of a small pond, almost like a mini lake. I found a fallen tree to sit on, rolled it closer for convenience, and set up my fishing rod. The day was beautiful. Not that it matters for the story, but it stuck with me because of what happened next. After settling down, I cast my line and lit up a cigarette, half hoping to catch something and half just enjoying the solitude. It was peaceful, and I felt like I could finally unwind. About 15 or 20 minutes later, I'd already caught a couple of small fish, but it wasn't a stellar outing. One even managed to leap out of the bucket since I forgot to secure the lid. I figured I'd give it one last go, so I used my last bit of bait, thinking that if I didn't get anything else, I'd let the others go. While waiting on my final cast, I suddenly heard a strange noise from across the water. It reminded me of a dog lapping up water after a long run, loud and slurping. I focused on the opposite shore and could barely make out something drinking there. My eyesight isn't great these days, but I could tell it wasn't anything I recognized, and that unsettled me. It was about the size of a large dog, maybe a deer, crouched low with its head dipping into the water. But then it did something no deer would ever do. It jumped straight into the water. I'm no wildlife expert, so I thought maybe it was some animal I didn't know about. Weird, but not impossible. A moment later, my fishing line jerked. I reached for the pole wedged into the tree trunk, but before I could react, the entire thing was pulled under. It happened so quickly that I had no chance of grabbing it. Shocked, I stared at the rippling water. I couldn't imagine what was strong enough to do that, and my thoughts went back to the creature I had just seen. Feeling uneasy, I grabbed my pocket knife, a small one, but sharp enough to defend myself, and started gathering my things. That's when I heard a sloshing sound behind me. My heart dropped. Summoning my courage, I turned around and nearly stumbled. The thing I'd seen across the water was now right in front of me. It was covered in slimy, scaly skin and had large webbed feet. Despite walking on all fours, it moved unnervingly fast. Its face was long and duck-like, with tiny, shiny black eyes. Around its neck were large gills that pulsed as it breathed. I could see rows of sharp, tiny teeth inside its mouth, and its hissing exhale made me sick to my stomach. The creature started advancing toward me. I held the knife out, hoping to keep it at bay, but it suddenly lunged. In sheer panic, I swung the blade and somehow managed to slash it across the gills. It let out a horrible screech and retreated back into the water. I didn't wait to see what it would do next. I left my gear behind and ran as fast as I could back to my truck. Once I got home, I called my friend and told him what happened. He didn't believe me at first, and honestly, I could hardly believe it myself. But the next day, we went back to the spot together, and the tracks that creature left were still visible in the mud. Since then, I haven't returned to that place. I don't know what kind of thing lives in the waters of Georgia, but I know I wasn't supposed to see it. I've avoided that area ever since, and I doubt I'll ever go back. I loved exploring when I was younger. When my family moved to a new house, I noticed a wooded area behind it, and I was thrilled. I must have been around 9 or 10 years old when this happened. We'd been living there for a few weeks, and I kept asking my parents to let me explore the woods, but they refused. They told me the fence in the backyard was put up specifically to keep kids like me out. My dad made it clear the fence wasn't to be crossed. That didn't stop me. On our first day there, I checked the fence and found one post that seemed loose. I figured if I pulled it hard enough, I could wiggle through. One afternoon, when my dad was at work and my mom was busy on the phone, I slipped outside, loosened the fence post, and squeezed into the woods. It was amazing. The tall trees were like something out of a storybook. I remember standing there, completely mesmerized, but I didn't waste too much time gawking. I wanted to see what I could find. Eventually, I discovered a well-trodden path. Maybe someone who had lived there before used it. The path was relatively clear, no big roots or thorn bushes to slow me down, so I ran along it, following where it led. Soon, I reached a small creek. It wasn't very wide, maybe about 3 feet across, but I realized I'd gone farther than I probably should have. Still, curiosity got the better of me. That's when I saw it. On the other side of the creek was a wolf. At least I thought it was a wolf at first. It looked hurt, with a deep wound on its side. The more it drank from the creek, the more it whimpered in pain. I wanted to help, but the water between us made it impossible. Then, something happened that still haunts me. The wolf started to change. Its form shifted, and in front of my eyes, it turned into a man. A fully grown, unclothed man. The whimpers became cries of agony. He looked right at me and begged for help. I froze. I didn't know what to do, so I ran. I sprinted all the way back to the house and managed to get inside without my mom noticing I'd been in the woods. When she asked why I was out of breath, I said I'd been running around the yard. She just laughed, but I was shaking inside. To this day, I haven't told my parents what I saw. This is the first time I've ever spoken about it. Could it have been a shapeshifter? A skinwalker? A werewolf? I still don't know. This happened to my cousin and me when we were pretty young. I think I was 11 and he was around 9. My uncle had built us a really cool hideout in a small patch of forest near the house. It wasn't very far in, but to us, it felt like a completely different world. After what happened, though, he tore it down and we weren't allowed back into the woods again. It was getting late when this all happened. The sun was low, but it wasn't dark yet, though it would have been in about an hour. I told my cousin it was time to head back, so I started gathering the snacks we'd brought while he went to relieve himself. Being 11, I was getting impatient and kept yelling at him to hurry up. Of course, he was being stubborn and ignoring me. That was until I pointed out the strange thing up in the trees. At first, he didn't believe me and told me to quit trying to scare him. But then he looked up and froze. He saw it too. He quickly zipped up and started moving back toward me. The creature perched on a branch above him was massive. It had long, sharp talons on scaly, yellow feet. Its piercing red eyes stared down at him, and its hooked beak opened to let out an ear-piercing screech. My cousin slowly backed away, and I could see his face pale with fear. As soon as he moved, the thing stretched out its enormous wings and dove toward us. The rush of air from its wings made me stagger. I tried to reach my cousin, but it was too quick. It struck him hard, knocking him to the ground, and he curled up, struggling to breathe. Without thinking, I grabbed him and bolted toward the house, praying the creature wouldn't chase us. I didn't stop running until we were in the kitchen, where my aunt was. All I could manage to say was, "He fell out of a tree." My brain must have come up with that lie, knowing no one would believe the truth. My cousin was rushed to the hospital, where they treated him for mild internal bleeding and nasty bruises on his chest. Thankfully, he recovered. In the following week, my uncle tore down the hideout and told us the woods were off limits. A month later, he put up a fence around the backyard to keep us from going anywhere near the forest. He didn't have to tell us twice. We had no desire to return. A few days after the incident, we heard the same screeching sound echoing from the woods, just like the noise it made before attacking my cousin. That was all the convincing we needed to stay far, far away. The story unfolds about 5 years ago, give or take. My buddy and I were taking a casual stroll through the forest near his home. We had been wandering for roughly 20 minutes when we stumbled upon two other guys. They appeared to be around our age, and we figured they were just out for a walk like us. Being friendly types, we stopped to chat for a bit. At first, the guys seemed a bit uneasy, but eventually opened up, telling us about a hangout spot. Their description was vague, but we were bored and figured, why not? Soon, we were tagging along as they led us further into the woods. We made small talk along the way, and they asked if we smoked. We said we did, and they mentioned having a spot near an old cabin where we could hang out. I was actually feeling optimistic, thinking we might discover a cool new place and maybe make some new friends. Little did I know how wrong I was. After a few more minutes of walking, we reached a rundown cabin. It looked ready to collapse at the slightest touch. One of the guys gestured toward it, saying, "Come on inside. We've got some cool stuff to show you." I was about to follow them in when my friend suddenly grabbed my arm. Confused, I turned to him, and he silently pointed toward a large boulder behind the cabin. I looked over and saw a foot quickly disappear behind it. Something felt very off. My friend muttered, "Hey, we should go. I just realized we're running late." As we started backing away, an older man emerged from behind the boulder, shouting at us. Without hesitation, we turned and sprinted back the way we had come. I don't know if the man chased us, but we didn't stop running until we were safely back at my friend's house. Once there, we told his parents what had happened. They decided to call the police, who arrived shortly after. The officers accompanied us back to the spot where we had seen the group. By the time we got there, the people were gone. The police inspected the cabin and the surrounding area, and although they didn't find much, what they did find was unsettling. A hammer, a small bag of pills, and a bunch of used syringes. I don't know what those people were up to, but whatever it was, I'm just thankful we didn't stick around to find out.